There was a moment, and the American Marines who were there will never forget it, when the laughter stopped. Not gradually, not after some polite realization. It stopped the way sound stops when a door slams shut, instantly, completely. The air went out of the room, and what replaced it was something those men had never expected to feel in the presence of soldiers from a country many of them couldn't find on a map without help. 12 minutes. That was all it took. Have you ever been absolutely certain about something? Dead certain, only to watch reality prove you wrong in real time? That gut-dropping feeling when the world doesn't work the way you assumed it did. If you have, then you already understand, on some level, what happened at that joint military exercise in the Philippine jungle. And if you've never experienced it, then what you're about to hear will change the way you think about what elite actually means. Because the lesson delivered that day wasn't written in a training manual. It came from 8 Filipino Scout Rangers, a patch of dense jungle, and 12 minutes that rewrote what American Marines thought they knew about warfare. Before we go any further, if stories like this move you, if you believe that the world deserves to know the truth about what these soldiers are capable of, then hit that subscribe button and leave a like. This channel exists to make sure these stories are never forgotten. And this one absolutely cannot be forgotten. It started the way these things often do, with confidence. Not the quiet, earned confidence of men who have seen real things, but the loud, unchecked confidence of men who had never been seriously challenged in their own specialty. The United States Marine Corps is one of the most formidable fighting forces in the history of human civilization. Nobody disputes that. Their training is relentless. Their doctrine is battle-tested across generations of conflict. Their pride is legendary. And when a group of Marine Raiders, the USMC's own Special Operations Forces, descendants of the elite units that raided Pacific Islands in World War II, arrived in the Philippines for joint exercises with the Philippine Army's 1st Scout Ranger Regiment, they arrived with that pride fully intact. They also arrived with something else, an assumption. The kind that doesn't announce itself, that sits quietly beneath every interaction, shaping what you see and what you don't. The assumption was simple. They were the professionals. The Filipinos were the hosts. And in the hierarchy of their minds, hosts don't outperform guests at their own specialty. The 1st Scout Ranger Regiment had been established on November 25, 1950, born in fire during the Hukbalahap Rebellion, when the Philippine government needed a force that could pursue guerrilla fighters through terrain so dense and punishing that conventional military units simply couldn't follow. The founders of the regiment modeled it on the American Alamo Scouts and the 6th Ranger Battalion, elite units that had earned their reputations in the Pacific theater of World War II. The irony of that lineage would become relevant soon enough. Over 70 decades, the Scout Rangers evolved into something that military analysts describe as one of the most specialized jungle warfare forces on Earth. Their selection process is notoriously brutal. Of every 100 candidates who begin the Scout Ranger course, only 20 to 30 complete it. The course itself runs 10 months. 10 months of punishing physical training, psychological stress, and technical instruction that covers jungle warfare, close quarters battle, counterinsurgency, sniper operations, and survival techniques that go far beyond what any textbook can teach. Morning runs begin at 5 kilometers and extend to 21, always conducted while carrying 20 kilograms of equipment plus a rifle. The training doesn't simulate the jungle, it happens in the jungle, in the same terrain where rangers have fought real enemies, where the consequences of a wrong decision have historically been measured in lives. The Marines who arrived for the joint exercises had heard some of this. Military professionals are rarely completely ignorant of their partner's capabilities. But hearing about something and truly believing it are two different things, and the gap between those two states is where that assumption lived.
The exercise began with briefings, equipment checks, and the kind of formal ceremony that militaries perform before the real work starts. The Scout Rangers who would participate were led by a senior officer whose name, for purposes of operational security, we will not use here. A man who had spent more than 15 years conducting actual combat operations in the jungles of Mindanao, in the mountains of the south, in terrain that had consumed better-equipped forces and sent them home shaken. He stood at the briefing, quiet, watching the Marines with the patient attention of someone who has learned that what people say in the first hour tells you almost everything you need to know about what they'll do in the 12th. The Marines were not subtle about their skepticism. It wasn't malicious, these were professionals, not bullies, but it was real. There were comments about equipment. The Rangers carried rifles that weren't the newest variants. Their gear was worn in the way that gear gets worn when it's been used constantly for years, not preserved for inspection. Their boots in particular attracted attention. Standard jungle boots, nothing exotic, nothing high-tech. One Marine, according to accounts from the exercise that circulated through both units afterward, made a remark about the boots that got some laughs. It was the kind of joke that seems harmless until the person it's directed at demonstrates in front of everyone exactly why it wasn't. The exercise scenario was a jungle infiltration and intelligence gathering mission. Both teams would operate simultaneously in separate corridors of the same dense Philippine jungle, a stretch of terrain that the Marine Raiders had trained for theoretically, but had never actually operated in. The jungle in the Sierra Madre and across the Philippine archipelago is not like any other jungle on Earth. Triple canopy forest blocks GPS signals. The density of the vegetation swallows radio communications. The humidity, consistently above 90%, degrades equipment at a rate that operators from temperate environments find almost impossible to prepare for. The heat doesn't just exhaust you, it thinks with you, slows your processing, makes decisions that were simple in a training room feel like calculations in a fog. Both teams were given identical mission parameters: move through a designated corridor of jungle, locate 3 specific checkpoints, gather information at each one, and extract, all while evading a notional enemy force that instructors and observers would represent. Time would be recorded, methods would be evaluated, performance would be documented. The Marines moved out first. They moved well, there's no other honest way to say it. These were trained, fit, disciplined operators who knew their craft. They maintained proper spacing and sector coverage. Their communications protocols were textbook. They moved tactically through the first 300 meters of jungle the way the manual says you should move through jungle when you don't know that jungle. Which is to say, they moved through it the way you move through something that is fighting you. The jungle fought back immediately. Equipment snagged on vines. Footfalls on the seemingly soft ground produced more sound than expected because the layers of leaf litter in that specific environment behaved differently than in training areas. Navigation became complicated within the first 20 minutes when their GPS units began dropping signal under the canopy, something the observers noted but did not intervene on because part of what was being evaluated was exactly this: how forces adapt when technology fails. Meanwhile, the Scout Rangers waited of the starting line of their corridor. A Marine observer assigned to watch their movement, a staff sergeant with 11 years of experience, 3 combat deployments, and a reputation within his unit for being genuinely unimpressible, positioned himself to document what he expected would be a competent but unremarkable performance. He had his notepad ready. He had his stopwatch ready. He was not ready for what happened next. The 8 Rangers moved into the jungle, and within 40 seconds, the staff sergeant had a problem. He could no longer see them. Not because the jungle was thick at that point, it wasn't, not compared to what lay deeper in. Not because visibility was low, it was early in the day and the light was reasonable. The Rangers had simply ceased to be visible in the way that humans are normally visible. They hadn't vanished dramatically, they had adjusted. Posture, spacing, the angle of their bodies relative to the vegetation, the way they placed each foot, and in doing so, they had transformed from 8 men moving through jungle into something that looked impossibly like 8 patches of jungle doing nothing in particular. The observer took 3 steps forward trying to track them. He couldn't.
He radioed to the lead evaluator. "I've lost visual on the Ranger element." The response from the evaluator: "How long were they in the tree line?" The observer checked his stopwatch. 40 seconds. Silence on the radio. Then, "Roger that. Keep moving parallel to their corridor." The observer moved. He followed the sounds, which were almost nothing. Occasional soft footfalls, a barely audible displacement of vegetation that you would not notice unless you were specifically listening for it. He was listening specifically for it, had been trained to detect exactly this kind of movement in a training environment, and he was barely catching it.
In the dense interior of the jungle ahead, in the kind of cover where any other force would have been wrestling and snapping their way through, the Rangers were operating in something that was functionally indistinguishable from silence. 12 minutes after entering the jungle, the Ranger element reached the first checkpoint. The Marines, operating simultaneously in their parallel corridor and facing genuinely similar terrain, reached their first checkpoint at 34 minutes. The observers didn't say anything to either team. This was data collection, not competition, but the numbers were being written down, and the staff sergeant observing the Rangers was writing with the handwriting of a man whose hand isn't quite steady. At the first checkpoint, the evaluation included a simulated contact scenario, a notional enemy position that each team had to identify, assess, and report without compromising their own location. The Marines handled it competently. They communicated appropriately, gathered the required information, and extracted without significant issues, though one member of the team moved in a way that an actual enemy sniper would have detected. The Rangers did something that the evaluators discussed for the remainder of the exercise and well beyond it. They did not approach the checkpoint the way troops approach checkpoints. They entered the area the way the area itself would move, slowly, incrementally, in a pattern that matched the environmental rhythms of that particular patch of jungle at that particular time of day. One ranger, tasked with forward reconnaissance, spent 11 minutes motionless in a position 20 meters from the checkpoint before anyone else in his team advanced. He wasn't resting, he was reading the checkpoint the way a doctor reads a patient, looking for signs that what appeared normal wasn't, looking for indicators of threat that no amount of technology could detect as reliably as a trained human being who had grown up in this environment and spent his career deepening that relationship. When they extracted from the checkpoint, they left no sign. The evaluator sent to inspect the area afterward found nothing, no disturbed vegetation, no broken stems. It was as if the jungle itself had performed the reconnaissance. The Marine raiders, when told later about these observations, were initially quiet in a way that their fellow Marines recognized as significant. These were men who did not do quiet easily. Their culture rewards volume, confidence, assertion, qualities that serve them extraordinarily well in the environments where Marines are typically deployed. But in the jungle, those qualities have a different relationship with survival. And somewhere in the silence that followed the evaluator's report, that truth was landing. By the midpoint of the exercise, the data being collected had produced a picture that nobody in the Marine element had anticipated. In every measurable category, speed of movement, noise discipline, navigation accuracy, checkpoint security, and contact simulation, the Scout Ranger element was performing at a level that the evaluators, all of them experienced military professionals with exposure to elite units from multiple nations, described as unlike anything they had witnessed in this type of terrain assessment. One evaluator, a retired Marine officer who had participated in similar exercises with British Royal Marines, French Foreign Legionnaires, and multiple Asian partner forces, said afterward, and this was later documented in a military publication focused on joint exercise outcomes, that what the Scout Rangers were demonstrating was not simply a different technique, it was a different relationship with the environment. The Marines were operating in the jungle. The Rangers were operating as part of it. The distinction sounds philosophical. In practice, it produced a performance gap that no amount of equipment, no quantity of preparation, and no superiority of doctrine could have closed in the short term. What made this particularly striking was what the Marines were working with. Their equipment was genuinely superior in measurable ways. Their rifles were newer, their communication systems were more advanced. Their boots, yes, the boots that inspired the early jokes, were engineered with materials and technology that no jungle boot of an earlier generation could match. They had GPS units, night vision systems, and body armor with integrated load-bearing features that the Rangers' older kit could not replicate. On paper, the Marine Raiders had every material advantage.
The Scout Rangers' approach to navigation illustrated why. The Philippine jungle has always defeated GPS-dependent forces, not because the technology is poor, but because the triple canopy defeats the signal repeatedly and unpredictably. Forces that rely on GPS discover this mid-mission at the worst possible time and spend critical minutes reorienting by alternative means. The Rangers never relied on GPS to begin with. They read the terrain itself, tree growth patterns that indicate compass direction as reliably as any instrument, water runoff that communicates elevation change and watershed position, the behavior of birds and insects that, to a trained observer, function as a biological clock and environmental compass simultaneously. They had been doing this since their first day of training in real jungle, not controlled environments. By the time a scout ranger completes his course, these skills are not learned behaviors. They are instincts. They happen the way breathing happens, without the conscious decision to perform them. The final checkpoint exfiltration was where everything became undeniable. Both teams had to exfiltrate their corridor under simulated enemy pursuit, a pressure scenario designed to reveal how units perform when tired, when stressed, and when the stakes of maintaining discipline are highest. Fatigued operators make noise. They take shortcuts that compromise their position. They break the habits that kept them safe in the easy parts of the mission. The Marine element, exhausted from a full day in the unfamiliar environment, exfiltrated competently. They maintained discipline, maintained communication, and exfiltrated without significant error. Under real conditions, against a real enemy, they would have survived. That matters. That is not a small thing. The Ranger element exfiltrated and was, for a significant portion of the route, impossible for the observer team to track. Not difficult to track, impossible. The senior evaluator, who had been following them for hours at that point, admitted afterward that there was a period of approximately 8 minutes during the exfiltration in which he had no confidence at all about the Rangers' position, despite knowing their route, their general direction, and having been observing them all day. They had adjusted to the pressure of pursuit, the way water adjusts to the shape of whatever contains it, not by fighting the shape, but by becoming it. When both teams reached the extraction point and the exercise concluded, the evaluators gathered all participants for a debrief. The Marine Raiders sat across from the Scout Rangers in a clearing at the edge of the jungle. The numbers were going to be presented, the assessments were going to be shared, and every Marine in that clearing already knew from the accumulated evidence of the day what was coming. The senior Marine officer present, a lieutenant colonel with 20 years of service, a man whose career had taken him through Somalia, Iraq, and multiple classified theaters, listened to the evaluator's summary without expression. When the evaluator finished, the lieutenant colonel sat with the information for a moment. Then he turned to the Scout Ranger commander. "You run this course for your selections?" he asked. "Every class," the commander said. "For how long?" 70 years. The lieutenant colonel nodded slowly, in the way that people nod when they are integrating something large. "We've been doing this wrong," he said. It wasn't self-criticism. It was the statement of a professional who has just received accurate information. What we were doing, it works everywhere else. Here, you're doing something else entirely. The Scout Ranger commander's response was the kind of answer that stays with people. We don't train for jungle, we train in jungle. From the first day, there is no simulation. When you train where the enemy is real, the training becomes real. What followed that debrief was something that doesn't happen easily or often in military culture, particularly between forces with a perceived hierarchy of capability. The Marine Raiders asked to stay, not for the remainder of the scheduled exercise, for additional time. They wanted instruction. They wanted to learn the movement techniques that had made the Rangers functionally invisible. They wanted to understand the navigation methods that didn't depend on satellite signal. They wanted to sit with the Scout Ranger instructors who had been doing this since before most of those Marines were born, and receive properly the education they had not expected to need. The Scout Rangers agreed without hesitation. This too is documented in accounts of the exchange, the absolute absence of any triumphalism from the Philippine side. There were no victory laps, no pointed references to the earlier jokes, no leveraging of the day's outcome to establish dominance. The Rangers who agreed to extend the exchange did so with the matter-of-fact generosity of people who understand that shared knowledge makes everyone who carries it more dangerous to the actual enemy. What we know, you should know. If teaching you makes you stronger, it makes all of us safer.
In the days that followed, the Marines learned things they hadn't been taught in any training program. They learned how to read Philippine jungle vegetation for direction and elevation data. They learned the specific movement technique that Scout Rangers call flowing, not a formal term, but a description of the philosophy. Don't fight the vegetation, find the path the jungle already provides and follow it. They learned how to place their feet in a sequence that distributes weight across multiple contact points, minimizing sound on every surface type they would encounter. They learned how to apply natural materials to reduce the visual signature of the human form in a way that went far beyond the principles their own camouflage doctrine had taught them. They also learned something that isn't in any technical manual. They learned what 70 years of real combat in one specific environment produces in a fighting force. Not just skill, but a particular kind of confidence that doesn't need to be loud because it has never needed to announce itself to be lethal. The United States Marines who participated in that exchange returned to their units changed. Not fundamentally different as warriors. They were already exceptional, and that didn't change, but changed in the way that anyone changes when they discover a blind spot they didn't know they had. Several of the participants later described the experience in terms that military professionals rarely use for training exercises. They described it as humbling. They described it as necessary. One sergeant major, interviewed years later as part of a broader review of joint exercise programs in the Pacific, said simply, "I went in thinking we were there to show them something. I left knowing they had shown us something we needed to know." The Scout Ranger Regiment today continues the work that those Rangers demonstrated that day. They train alongside American, Australian, British, and Japanese forces regularly through exercises like Balikatan, Salaknib, and the annual Jungle Operations Training Course at Camp Texan. American commanders who have participated in those programs describe the Scout Rangers in terms that have become consistent across decades of interaction: technically excellent, environmentally superior in jungle terrain, and possessed of a cultural cohesion that translates directly into operational effectiveness. The selection process that produces Scout Rangers remains among the most demanding in the world. 20 to 30 successful candidates from every 100 who attempt it. 10 months of training that doesn't pause, doesn't simulate, and doesn't protect candidates from the real conditions they will face in service. The jungle that shaped them is the jungle they fight in. The skills that selection and training produce are the skills that combat demands. There is no gap between preparation and reality, because Scout Ranger training is designed to eliminate that gap entirely. The boots, by the way, are still standard jungle boots. Nothing exotic, nothing high-tech. The Rangers who wear them have been known in subsequent joint exercises to cover ground that operators in far more expensive footwear could not match. 12 minutes. That's what it took for 8 Filipino Scout Rangers to transform a room full of confidence into a room full of silence. Not through aggression, not through showmanship, not through any of the gestures that forces sometimes use to establish dominance, through performance, through the demonstration in real time on real ground of what happens when 70 years of true expertise meets the assumption that expertise belongs only to the powerful. The jungle keeps its own records. It doesn't care about budget or firepower or the flags sewn on sleeves. It responds only to understanding. And in that clearing at the edge of the trees, when the evaluators finished their summary and the Marines sat with what they'd heard, the jungle had delivered its verdict clearly and without appeal. The Scout Rangers were home. Everyone else was visiting. And the visitors, to their credit, were wise enough to recognize what they'd seen and humble enough to ask if they could learn from it. That is the story the world needs to hear. That is why these men deserve to be remembered. Not just in the Philippines, everywhere.